welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, this week we have series of lecture on Indian scientists and freedom struggle. Generally, when we talk about the freedom struggle, the passage of important leader of the time comes. But how Indian scientists contributed those days, we don't know. Yeah, we know very in little way. So, what was the role of Indian scientists during freedom struggle? We'll try to understand in 3 lectures. I will also come to know the particular scientists who contributed on this, like Amensa and others. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Jain Sinha, an academician, eminent historian, and presently he is teaching history in Delhi University, has written many books, and regularly contribute on different national and international journals. So I think his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic, and his area of interest is science and freedom of struggle. So naturally his expertise in this field will help us to understand the topic. So on his behalf, I welcome him for the EduSet lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. As it has been introduced, we are going to talk about the contribution of the Indian scientists towards freedom struggle. Under this topic, I will deliver 3 lectures, and through that I will try to bring to light how the Indian scientists contributed in the War of Independence right from the beginning until 1947. So for that I have chosen first the contribution of ML Sarkar, that is Mahendra Lal Sarkar. ML Sarkar is comparatively little known, which is unfortunate, but his contribution has been substantial. And to understand his contribution, we should better go into the details of the Indian Renaissance, which is also at times presented as the national awakening in the 19th century. So, to refer to the national awakening, it is general knowledge that the beginning was made by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and it was carried forward by a generation of other eminent persons, great reformers of that time, and from Raja Ram Mohan Roy to Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, then Dayanand Saraswati, Ramakrishna Paramhans, Swami Vivekanand, Syed Ahmad Khan, and several others were there who tried to improve the Indian society intellectually and otherwise. In that effort, one of the significant features was the interest in the Western science, and that was shown by Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And he emphasized that for the progress of India, we must accept and adopt the sciences from the West. We should improve our knowledge, and we should practice it also in life. But he didn't do much towards that. Of course, something beginning was made, but he diverted his attention to social reforms, liberation of women, then against religious documentaries, etc. But after that, the phase continued, and in which we can notice that there was just a hesitation whether to go for the Western science or to go for the indigenous science. This difference can be seen especially between the supporters of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, that is Brahmo Samaj, and supporters of Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj gave a call for India's traditional indigenous sciences, and they wanted to revive it and to practice it. But the call for the modern knowledge and its application continued throughout the century, and in that direction, if we notice, that call went on becoming stronger day by day. But in the meanwhile, that debate continued, and one of the persons who took up the matter in a much concrete manner was Mahendralal Sarkar. So Mahendralal Sarkar shouldn't be seen just as an individual scientist or a doctor that he was. Rather, he should be considered as one of the leaders of the 19th century Renaissance or awakening. So, in that context, when we see him in that context, we will be able to evaluate his contribution to the freedom struggle. Just at the outset, I will try to make it clear that his contribution to freedom struggle was not in terms of any political agitation, etc. Rather, it was in terms of preparing a background in which the freedom struggle could thrive, and it could rise from there, it could make its beginning from there, because all the call for the national awakening that was made in 19th century, it was just for improving the condition of the country. And towards that end, different scholars and different leaders, they made their efforts. So it was in that category that Mahendralal Sarkar wanted to do through the promotion of modern science. Please note here that it was not indigenous science, rather it was through the promotion of modern science that he wanted to develop and reconstruct this country, and that development was definitely against the background of backwardness and poverty that had come as a result of the foreign and the British rule. So this was the beginning of his contribution there. He was very much interested in promoting, he was convinced and he was interested that the Western sciences should be promoted, but what was the different approach he wanted to introduce in India? And that different approach was that he wanted that India should be self-sufficient and it should help itself in terms of harnessing and developing modern sciences. So in that respect, his contribution started with the establishment of the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science in 1876. Again, it is very strange that very few people know about this institution, though it is still surviving, and it is the same institution which brought India's first Nobel Prize in physics, because C.V. Raman worked there and he was awarded the Nobel Prize. So it was the beginning of Sarkar's contribution by establishing an institution which flourished and progressed throughout the span of the freedom struggle, and still it is continuing. What was the role to begin with of this institution? So most of the contribution Mahendralal Sarkar made, it is centered on the ICAS, that is Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. And from there, his efforts radiated to different areas and different walks of life through intellectual activities, and that became instrumental, that led to a general awakening which was later on gradually recognized as nationalism and patriotism. And his effort to promote science gave Indians a type of pride, national pride, and it showed the capacity and capabilities of the Indian people that they were also capable of promoting modern science. So this great event took place in 1876. We can note that this is the time of several other activities in the country also on the similar line. Take for example, this was the year when Arya Samaj and Aligarh movement were started in 1876, and they were also very much interested in sciences, especially in terms, if we talk about Aligarh movement of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he was squarely interested in promoting modern science and technology, initially science, and for that he established a scientific society. Subsequently, another scientific society was established in Bihar Scientific Society. Likewise, the Arya Samaj also emphasized the importance of education, and for that they opened several schools and colleges, of which the DAV College, Dayanand Anglo Vedic school and college, the Vidyalaya, they became very much important in later life, and even today they are existing in almost all the major cities of our country. So what I want to suggest, that in the beginning of the freedom struggle, the rising that was coming in the mind and society of the people of India took in terms of education and science, and all of them were talking about science. In case of Brahmo Samaj, they talked also about the indigenous sciences, but others, they were perhaps convinced that the development of indigenous science had stopped much earlier, and it was perhaps not possible to revive it very meaningfully at that stage of time. So they turned to Western science itself. While Aligarh Andolan that was started and led by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, that didn't exactly emphasize about how to achieve self-sufficiency and self-help. Of course, he has started a college and a society. The college later on became a university, but there was not emphasis on exactly creating self-sufficiency. But here the institute started by Mahendralal Sarkar, it emphasized that the Indians should be educated in modern science, they should be trained in its practice, and that understanding and a skill and experience should go into the society to improve the quality of India's life there. So this was his motive. With a small beginning, though comparatively it was not very small, because being a doctor, he was able to convince several people, and throughout the 60s and 70s, he fully led a campaign for establishing an institution which will be controlled by Indians and which will educate Indians in modern sciences, and it will inspire them to harness that science for improving the life in the country. So, before moving further, we would like to know a little about his personal life, because it had some meaning and it can be compared with several other reformers of the time, or those reformers and scientists of later time. He was born in a small village near Calcutta, near Havra, in Havra district. He lost his parents at an early stage, and he lived with his maternal uncle. So, in general, it was life of poverty. But he was very bright, and he later on he finished his medical education, and he was the second person to receive MD degree from the University of Calcutta in medical science. Initially, he practiced in allopathy, in modern medicine, but gradually he was attracted to homeopathy. He read some of the classics of that time, and those classics convinced him that the homeopathy was very much in the spirit of Indian people. Again, he also thought that it was a better alternative treatment for diseases. He read the book by William Morgan, The Philosophy of Homeopathy, and several other books he read. He interacted with eminent homeopaths of that time, and finally he devoted his time in practicing in homeopathy. So, what is significant in terms of freedom struggle here is a few points. First, his practice and his brilliance both in allopathy and homeopathy made him very much prominent, also because he cured some of the most prominent persons of the time, including Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Arvindo and the Maharaja of Tripura. So this brought him in the limelight, and when he started his movement for establishing an institution, that also was helpful in generating fund for establishing his association society that was called Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. He had also treated Vivekananda. So he was a legendary doctor, and this background helped him in establishing his Center for Scientific Research and Education and Demonstration. Another thing which is vital and needs to be explained clearly, that his emphasis on homeopathy was significant also because it was a deviation from the traditional fascination for a medical science, modern Western medical science, which came through the British and other Europeans. Here he left that track and he wanted to establish an alternative therapy, and that was homeopathy. We may recall that the basic roots of homeopathy was in Germany, and Germany has been the leading promoter of homeopathy. And we can also note that Germany and Britain didn't have had very good relations from the beginning and later on also. So all the freedom, the movement, leaders of the freedom movement, gradually we will note that they would gradually leave the source of Europe, and they will move towards those countries which were either hostile or neutral about the colonial rule in India. So they went to Germany. Likewise, later on we will see that some of the scientists, they also went towards Japan, because Japan was far off from Britain. It was an Asian country, and at that time or a little later we can see that Japan was one of the propounders of the movement of Asian unity. That Asian unity was not in the vacuum. It had some political and economic background. Why this Asian unity? Because Asia was being encroached upon by different colonial powers of the world, by Britain, by the Dutch and Portuguese, by French. So now there was need to an unity which could stand against those type of colonizers. So this deviation from Britain or any other country of Western Europe to an Eastern country, including the Eastern European country or the non-British group, that is Germany, or the Asian country like Japan, it was a symbolic gesture of the Indian people leaders that they were now not in a position even at an emotional level to surrender themselves to the British. So they deviated from there and they opted for things which were not exactly British or French. So all these developments were taking place, and it was at this time that Mahendralal Sarkar started the institute, and after that establishment of Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, it was coming closer to the national awakening, especially of Bengal at that time. We can recall that this was in Bengal also the period of the Young Bengal movement led by Henry Derecio. And that movement, again, it was not against the Western knowledge. It was in favor of Western knowledge, but it was in favor of acquiring that knowledge and practicing it with Indian help, and to create self-help and self-sufficiency in that sphere. So this was the stand, a parallel stand, as Mahendra Lal Sarkar was contributing to this country. He was not making any political slogans, but by creating this institution, he was creating every year a generation of scientists who will like to achieve self-sufficiency for their country, who would like to excel at the international level, and all these efforts. And he wanted to promote through his center, through his association, he wanted to popularize sciences among the common people there. So initially it was just like a club, and people were allowed to present their papers there or demonstrate some exhibition or their finding. And later on, with larger funding, some labs were created where scientists will practice actual sciences. And we may recall that one of the best scientists of that time, almost all of them were associated with the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. Among them, we may name C.V. Raman, who got India's first Nobel Prize in 1930. Likewise, with the others concerned with this association were P.C. Ray, Amensa, S.N. Bose, and a whole range of people, whole array of people were there who were associated, who were promoting the cause of the Indian Association for the cultivation of science. In fact, it was the it was the time also of the Swadeshi movement. We may recall that the Swadeshi movement took place around 1899, and it continued effectively up to almost up to 1908 or 10. And this was the period of national education movement also. Here, I want to emphasize that during the Swadeshi movement, its promoters were interested in developing the economy and society of the country, but there was a debate whether to use Western science or whether to use indigenous sciences and craft for promoting and reconstructing the country. That debate was going on, but in that debate, what came out, what emerged as the most prominent line was of those people who supported the use and promotion of Western sciences and technology. And so P.C. Ray, who was also associated with this association, he was very much active, and in fact from the scientific perspective, he was leader at that time during the Swadeshi movement. He established himself an industry, which is Bengal Chemical at that time. He delivered ceaselessly lecture among the people how to make use of modern science. And he inspired a whole generation of his students, his pupils, who later on became very important and who fought for freedom. So at that time of the Swadeshi movement, P.C. Ray contributed, he carried forward the legacy of Mahendra Lal Sarkar. Again, I am remembering again and again Mahendra Sarkar, even while I am discussing about other developments, because the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science continued to remain a basic platform in Calcutta for all the scientists who were active, who were practicing modern science, but they were also against the British rule and who were dedicated to bringing about a national reconstruction and national awakening. So these development continued throughout this period, and the legacy of Mahendra Lal Sarkar continued. Another contribution at the whereas we will talk again about Mahendralal Sarkar's scientific activities, but here it's important to point out that he also supported women education at that time at personal level and also at the institutional level. And it was through his effort that Bengal women were educated in Bengal in a larger number, and we may recall the contribution of these women in the freedom struggle. So all these things taking place. Another thing that Mahendralal Sarkar, he was a doctor, he was a scientist in that term. He was founder of the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. In that way, he was promoter of science and technology. But equally important is the fact that throughout his life, he held several civic positions in Calcutta. In Calcutta Municipal Corporation and at several other forums, he was an important figure. And those positions were helpful for promoting his cause. And this is why among the other scientific movements taking place in different parts of India at that time, the movement in Bengal became very much important, and it was very effective. It continued through the freedom struggle and almost until the end of the freedom movement when India achieved independence in 1947. So Mahendralal contribution continues as an institution, and through a generation of people who were trained at his center in Calcutta. This group of people, especially of P.C. Ray, J.C. Bose, Amensa, S.N. Bose, they were some of the important, J.C. Ghosh, they were some of the important persons who started from the association, ICAS, and from there they spread their knowledge in different parts of the country. And not only that, some of them, they became a type of national hero, national leader. I will talk about two of them who were closely associated with the association and initially with Mahendralal Sarkar also, and they were P.C. Ray and Amensa. P.C. Ray was a senior person, but he continued to live throughout the freedom struggle. He died in 40s, but he was an active scientist. He was the person who was educated in Britain. He got his DSc from there, but while living there, he criticized the British government. And from there, when he came to India, he started a movement through the Swadeshi that we should try to make use of modern science, not the ancient traditional Indian science, and through modern science, we should try to make use of the national resources of the country for wide-ranging national reconstruction. So all these things were taking place somehow around this ICAS, this Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. Another leader I would like to talk about was Amensa. Amensa, again, he was a student of P.C. Ray. And P.C. Ray, he also lived there in Calcutta. He also worked at the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, and from there he guided his students who became very much vocal. P.C. Ray, like Mahendralal Sarkar, came from a very poor family, from a village near Dhaka, now Bangladesh, but he was educated in Calcutta, and he very early he was influenced by the socialist philosophy, socialist ideology, but he had great faith in the capacity of modern science and technology. He was picking up the threads of M.L. Sarkar and he was carrying forward, and his faith led him to see all the developments in science in a wider perspective, and that perspective was development and poverty of India. So it was from 1920s onwards that he took up the matters at the national level of things like flood, famine, natural resources, rivers, management of rivers, forests, etc. And by 1930, mid-30s, he became so vocal and so active that he approached the Congress leadership. And with his effort, a national planning committee was created at that time, about which I will talk later on in detail, but very briefly here, he created that organization that was a committee started by the Indian National Congress, and that committee was assigned the task of planning for 10 years for India's development, and that planning was to be inducted after Azadi, which at that time seemed to come very soon. And in that organization, Amensa was very much active, and it was thanks to him that later on, when all the national leaders were sent behind bar, it was Saha and his group and several other people who had been associated with the association, that they carried forward the legacy of Mahendra Lal Sarkar and people like them forward, and they took the agenda of the national leadership when all of them were sent behind bar, and they tried to execute it in some way. Of course, their area was science, and so they could act only mainly in science, but they had already started a magazine in 1934 that was Science and Culture, and they were writing very important articles and enlightening people all over the country about the social functions of science and how to manage science for the welfare of the society. The whole magazine was based on the model of the great magazine Nature, which was published from abroad. So all these developments were taking place in 20th century, but if we go in their genesis, all the genesis goes to the first Swadeshi movement, and if we go into the roots of the development of developments of Swadeshi movement, we will go to the area which was covered by the activities of Mahendra Lal Sarkar. Mahendra Lal Sarkar's contribution in that way can be compared something with not exactly with the later scientists, rather with the social reformers of that time and educationists of the national awakening of 19th century. He should better be compared with them, though he was a scientist. And what is different from them, take for example Swami Vivekanand, Rajaram Mohan Rai, and all those leaders, because they interacted with the society in terms of religion and caste and other issues, so their activity was definitely larger than Mahendra Lal Sarkar's. But Mahendra Lal Sarkar, whatever he did only one thing which is most notable, and that is in the institution of his association. But that was so solid, that was so profound, and in coming years that led to a lot of progress of science and technology in the country, and that science and technology give the country a sense of pride, and to the world it showed that Indians could be as capable and as strong in science and knowledge than any other people in the world, because through this association we got our first Nobel Prize, which was achieved by C.V. Raman. So these were the contribution which Mahendra Lal Sarkar made. Apparently we do not see direct links, but we see that he creates an institution in 1876, and that institution continues. Even now, that institution is in Calcutta. Now it is run by the Ministry of Science and Technology, and it's still it's a great center of scientific research, etc. After that, we can also talk about Mahendralal Sarkar social life, of which I have just made a small reference. But what I want to suggest that he introduced science not from exactly outside. He was not outsider who brought something from abroad and introduced it. Rather, he was one who had interest in science, who had read modern medical science, but note it, he was the person who left it also, because he thought about India's tradition and culture, and he thought that what could be a better alternative, and homeopathy came there, because for him homeopathy was cheaper, it could be easily available, and more than that, it suited to the Indian psyche, where we want to see generally Indians think in terms of philosophy. And there is a deep philosophy in homeopathy, and again, which I have already referred, that he was talking about an alternative system which was different from the system which was promoted by the British at that time. So even if he was not saying anything, he was protesting the British. It is something like the acts of Swami Vivekananda. He was not crying any slogan against the British, but what he said, what he preached at that time meant that people should revolt against the British, because Vivekananda used to say that you shouldn't tolerate gulami, you shouldn't tolerate oppression. If you are oppressed, it is your sin also, so you should revolt against that. It was his call. So he is not saying, asking British to go away from the country, but what he is instilling in the mind of people was something like a protest of the British here. In the same vein, Mahendralal Sarkar also talked about his sciences, and he just suggested that it's good for us. What's different there should be that we should control it, and it shouldn't be controlled by outsider, it should be controlled by our resources. And he, through his social contact, being a great doctor, he was very much resourceful socially. So he contacted people, and people made huge donations at that time. And that donation came, when it came to this association, even the British Indian government of that time was influenced, and it didn't mind being associated with the new association, and it also offered grants for that. So this is a peculiar situation. He is making an inroad into the British hold in the country, but the British, I don't know, I haven't gone into details, but I don't know why the British joined it. Either it was their tactics at that time, because even at the time of Raja Ram Mohan Rai, they got associated with him, and they supported some of the demands of Raja Ram Mohan Rai, and they abolished some of the evils of the time, including sati. And at that time, their tactics was just to keep Indians pleased, if it could be done through some administrative measures. So it was a tactic at that time. Why this tactic was still, it is being used in 1870s onwards, it needs to be noted, because this is the time when the British are promoting communalism also. They are instigating some minority groups in the country around, say, around 1905 and all, and there is communal tension. That communality is also introduced by the British by the Act of 1909, and later on it is expanded in 1919 by extending the communal franchise. but why they were supporting them at that time needs to be examined properly, because the British expressed their grants, gave grants to this association, and they were knowing that Indians are doing research there, they are proving their capabilities, and in the meanwhile, India got its first Nobel Prize also. So it is for historian to see and go into details that why Mahendra Lal Sarkar's organization received grants from them at that time. Otherwise, the British government shouldn't have given grant. Not only that, on the governing council, the Viceroy was there, on its Governor General was there on the governing council of Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. So all these, perhaps these development, why the British government cooperated with the individual project of Mahendra Lal Sarkar, it was also because, as I think, because of his own stature of being a great doctor, a great intellectual, as one who was very much prominent in the civic life, because he did hold several posts in the society, from being the head of something municipal corporation, and that he was on the university council and on several other organizations. So not only as a scientist, rather as an intellectual, as a doctor, as a philanthropist, he was creating his clout, and that clout impressed upon the British. Maybe it threatened them also, so they collaborated them, and at least they didn't hinder his efforts. And it is very crucial, because there was no objection. In some cases, the British had objected, especially later on, of these type of scientific projects, as in case of the recommendations of the National Planning Committee.
We have a caller from West Bengal, so take up the question first. Good afternoon, please ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir.
Ji.
Sir, I want to ask you about the contribution of scientists towards development of Indian industries and scientific institutions. I want to ask you about the contribution of Indian scientists about the development of indigenous industries.
Okay.
And schools and colleges for the promotion of science and technology.
Okay.
What is last?
Indian indigenous industry.
Okay. My answer won't be very encouraging that way, that I can't cite much examples of Indian scientists who wanted to revive indigenous industry. But there was a halfway contribution, and that contribution we may recall about the activities of P.C. Ray. P.C. Ray was a modern scientist, but in course of the Swadeshi movement, when he led a movement to create self-help in scientific matters in the country, he also talked about making use of natural resources, and those natural resources also included those resources which were popular in the indigenous sciences. For example, he tried to make use of neem plant and neem tree for making toothpaste and other things. So in that way he promoted it. He started Bengal Chemical, and I understand a few preparations were derived on the indigenous method of Ayurveda and something like that. In that way, not the scientists, rather technocrats, some technocrats at that time during Swadeshi movement, they wanted to revive industries, but mostly those industries failed. They were in the field of transport and communication and textile, etc. But lastly, what was the much more important contribution that was made by Rabindranath Tagore and his other friends at the time?
We have another call from Ujre. Good afternoon, please ask your question.
Sir, so my question is,
Yeah.
Syed Ahmad Khan is a scientist or more a social scientist?
Okay.
Social scientist.
Who?
Sayyid Ahmad
I
Khan.
think it is
Yeah.
clear.
Of course, he was not a scientist. He was, in fact, he was a bureaucrat. He was a government employee. So there is no question of calling him scientist. But definitely, he appreciated the importance of modern science, and he wanted to promote it. And for that, something like Mahendra Lal Sarkar, he created an organization before Mahendra Lal Sarkar. That was the Scientific Society. So he was not a scientist, but he
social
promoted
scientist.
science. And in that case, you can say he was social scientist, but not in academic sense of the term, because he was not a scholar. He was just a bureaucrat. He was holding some post, perhaps education officer he was. So we can't call him a social scientist also.
Okay. So now you continue with sir.
So this is I have most of the things I have said that he supported the environment which was springing up towards the close of 19th century, and which was inspiring nationalism in the country, that got a great boost from the efforts of Mahendra Lal Sarkar. Mahendra Lal Sarkar, he through his organization also created a tradition of intellectual activities in the field of science and technology in Calcutta. And that tradition that proliferated there. And so it was not confined to the association, rather several associations, smaller associations
we have another
were
caller.
formed at that time.
We have another call from Gujarat. Good afternoon. Please ask your question.
इतनी सारी पॉलिटिकल पार्टियों से फ्रीडम पाने के लिए हमारे साइंटिस्ट अब क्या कर सकते हैं? पहले तो बात अलग थी, अभी इन इतनी सारी पॉलिटिकल पार्टियों से देश को मुक्ति की जरूरत है। पॉलिटिकल पार्टियां नहीं होनी चाहिए और चुनाव होने चाहिए और जनप्रतिनिधि चुने जाने चाहिए। ये आदर्श लोकशाही की आज देश को जरूरत है। पहले सिचुएशन विदेशियों से मुक्ति की थी, आज सिचुएशन
आपका प्रश्न समझ में आ गया।
देश में फ्रीडम की है।
आप एक
पार्टियों से फ्रीडम
हाँ
की
मैं
है।
समझ
धन्यवाद।
रहा हूँ, लेकिन आप ब्रीफ एक क्वेश्चन पूछें जिसका मैं
उनका
रिप्लाई
प्रश्न
करूँ।
हमको लगता है कि उस पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम जो है अभी का सिस्टम उससे रिलेटिव है, लेकिन हमारा कंसर्न उससे नहीं, हमारा तो कंसर्न है।
फिर भी मैं आपका उत्तर क्वेश्चन जो है अपने आप में काफ़ी इम्पोर्टेंट है, और इस सेंस में इम्पोर्टेंट है कि महेंद्र लाल सरकार से लेकर के आज़ादी की लड़ाई के दौरान भारत के साइंटिस्ट की बड़ी ज़बरदस्त भूमिका थी, जिसको राजनीतिक नेताओं ने छुपा दिया है। उसको उन्होंने नहीं छुपाया है, इतिहासकारों ने इस पर बहुत गौर नहीं किया, इस बात पर कि गांधी जी के साथ साथ पीसी रे की भी भूमिका थी। और ये बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग बात है कि उस समय के साइंटिस्ट देश की सामान्य समस्याओं के बारे में भी बोलते थे और आंदोलन करते थे। आज़ादी के बाद कोई भी बड़ा साइंटिस्ट सामूहिक तौर पर किसी आंदोलन की बात, सामाजिक आंदोलन की बात नहीं कर पा रहा है, ये बड़ी दुर्भाग्य की बात है। और थोड़े बहुत प्रयत्न होते हैं तो वो अलग आइसोलेटेड प्रयत्न हैं। जो आप कह रहे हैं उससे मैं सहमत हूँ कि जो राजनीति इतना ज़्यादा हावी हो गया है कि बाकी अच्छी चीज़ें, सारी चीज़ें दब गई हैं, तो उसको ऊपर लाने के लिए तो आप हमको और सभी इंटेलेक्चुअल को एक आंदोलन करने की ज़रूरत है।
अपनी बातों को रखने का लोकतंत्र का तो यही महत्व है कि अपनी बातों को विभिन्न फोरम पर रखें। जी सर, कंटिन्यू करें।
ठीक है, चलें हम लोग और कुछ बात करें इस पर।
जी, तो जिस तरह से साइंटिस्ट उस समय योगदान दे रहे थे सामाजिक मुद्दों को लेकर, या जो उनका अपना विचार था उसको सामने रख रहे थे, आपने कहा कि उसको रखना चाहिए, तो क्या एक साइंटिफिक फोरम जो अभी चर्चा करते हैं तो उनको जो विषय वस्तु होता है केवल साइंस होता है,
हाँ।
तो उस विषय वस्तु को चेंज करने की जरूरत है क्या?
एकदम चेंज करने की जरूरत है। मैं आपको याद दिलाऊं उसी जमाने से कि उस समय एक डॉन सोसाइटी थी, ये बनी थी महेंद्र लाल सरकार के टाइम में ही, हालांकि उसको बनाने वाले और लोग थे। वो डॉन सोसाइटी सभी सामाजिक मुद्दों, साइंस का पर तो जिक्र करता ही था, सभी सामाजिक मुद्दों पर भी डिस्कशन करता था। और उससे बड़ा एक मैगजीन निकाला गया, साइंस एंड कल्चर, 1934-5 में वो निकला, जो कि जो अभी हम लोग बातें कर रहे हैं समाज के वो सभी मुद्दे पर, लेकिन साइंटिफिक दृष्टि से वो बात करते थे। जैसे कोई गरीबी है तो उसका क्या समाधान निकल जाएगा, तो साइंटिफिक तरीका बतलाते थे कि ये फसल इंट्रोड्यूस कीजिए उस इलाके में या जमीन में चेंज लाइए, लेकिन हाईली कंसर्न्ड थे। बहुत ही रिमार्केबल बात है। और उस जमाने में जो यहाँ के इंटेलेक्चुअल साइंटिस्ट जो एक्टिव थे वो वर्ल्ड के बेस्ट साइंटिस्ट के बराबर थे। उसी समय ब्रिटेन में लेट 1930s में एक सोशल रिलेशंस ऑफ साइंस मूवमेंट चल रहा था। उसी के पैरेलल में इंडिया में भी डेवलपमेंट था। ये कहना मुश्किल है कि वहाँ से प्रभावित हुए या इंडिपेंडेंट हुआ, हम नहीं जाएंगे, लेकिन यहाँ आंदोलन चल रहा था। और अच्छी बात यह है कि पॉलिटिशियन भी उसमें थे। उसमें दो आदमी का नाम मैं ले सकता हूँ, नेहरू का और सुभाष चंद्र बोस का।
We have another caller from West Bengal. Good afternoon. Please ask your question.
Hello.
जी, सवाल पूछिए।
Sir, I want to ask about the development of schools and colleges and scientific institutions like Bose Institute and Saha Institute and others, and their contribution towards the development of scientific temper in India.
Okay.
What is his question?
There were several institutions that come up during freedom struggle, other like Bose institutions, Saha institutions. So their contribution in the society during freedom struggle, how it can be explored.
Now
we are even in those days.
No,
their contribution.
Of course, they made great contribution. In fact, Saha Institute it came later on, but Indian Association for the Cultivation, about which I have talked all in detail, definitely they made great contributions, and we know very little about that contribution. It is on failure on our part and part of historians and the intellectuals. Definitely they made contribution, and it is time again that they should make contribution beyond technically spoken what is called science and technology. They should try to reach the society and culture also.
Yeah, we need to have a little relook on these things.
Yes.
Like even the question which he asked, how to get rid of the political parties, a political leader, that is not the question. We have to understand it academically. What the other thinker, political thinker, social scientists and others, they have given their views, analyze them and then come to the conclusion.
Yes.
So these are the, it's a good point that they have raised, that how to see the science and present society and also the present problem in unison.
Yes.
So the only solution we can say that it's through dialogue only we can overcome such situations.
Definitely. But I would say that it is time for historians and the scientists to rise and take their responsibility to promote the cause of science and technology for the welfare of the society.
Okay, what are the probable reasons you see that the participation from the different walk of the life, say academics, medicine or the industry, they are not participating so actively as we saw in the freedom struggle?
I think first due to heavyweight politics, power game, and in that power game the authorities are distributing benefits to people, and those people who are in the field of science and other areas, they are afraid of speaking even very sound criticism against any government, not present or future, any government, in the hope that if I speak, I will be losing something, some opportunities. I won't gain that position. So this is, you can say, heavyweight power politics and corruption.
Okay, so we see the contradiction here. They are not much involved in this power game, but they are held in high esteem. The people are holding them in high respect. Scientists and other people different working in different areas. So this contradiction, how did that match? How do you explain this contradiction?
They are held in high esteem because of their work. They have produced something substantial. I won't say that scientists, they are not doing something. They are doing something. What is regrettable that they are confined just within their lab. They produce good things as a result of their research, but they are not looking beyond that. That is problem. There are several problems in the society, and they are focused on that, but they are not ready to. They are not ready to have a dialogue with the political system and the authorities.
And not even with the people or the
Yes,
people
yes,
who
they are
in,
not interested.
Yeah.
Somehow they are not interested.
Well, they are happy in their
Yes,
own confinement.
something like a job, we are getting salary and we will do the project, maybe meaningfully also. But beyond that, they are not concerned about speaking.
Yeah, otherwise the world is wide open, they can come and participate and contribute much.
And in fact, it is a greater responsibility because they are in some way, they are wiser people. They are understanding not only the society, they are understanding the nature also. So they have a better grip over the whole problems of society than average people, even politicians. So we wish there are scientists like Amensa. Amensa, he was a parliamentarian also. He was member of the Royal Society. He made seminal contribution to world science and astrophysics. But all through his life, he talked about flood, about poverty, about bad effects of religion and all these things. He talked about education. He talked about women. He talked about children. He talked about old people. Okay. And he was a scientist. I don't think any scientist is talking today about whole range of society, even a larger range of society. I don't see any scientist today.
Okay. So they need to come out.
Yes, they need to come out of that, and they should realize their responsibilities. Okay. Yes. There have been great scientists like J.D. Bernal. He has started writing book for common people, that what is the function of science and technology, and it has enlightened the whole world.
Yeah.
Yes.
So even writing the discovery or kind of things which are in complex language, in simple language, so that
simple,
people can
in a
understand.
Popular style. Yeah.
Okay, so that people can understand and realize that these are the
I wish great scientists come on TV channels and they speak, and rather they discuss, not speak, not monologue, rather discussion with people from the society, civic society.
Okay, what is their viewpoint? How do they say the problem?
Yes, there should be also politicians.
Yeah.
Yes.
People from the different part of the language should participate.
We know that many of the projects are not designated at a particular context or place because of any expert advice. Rather, in most cases, it is a political decision, irrespective of parties. That the scientists should object to that. We know about the present disaster in Uttarakhand.
Okay.
Yes. Some scientific warning could have done better.
Well,
yes.
So, well, friends, with this word we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. Jain Sinha for giving such a wonderful lecture. Tomorrow we'll have another lecture on Indian scientists in freedom struggle. Thank you very much.